The sun shone brightly as Carmelo pulled his sleek black SUV into the long, winding driveway of Ridgefield Country Club. The grandeur of the property was unmistakable, with its manicured lawns, sprawling golf course, and the stately building that loomed ahead. It was a symbol of status, wealth, and exclusivity. For years, this club had been the playground of the elite, a place where deals were made over cigars and brandy, and where the faces of its members were overwhelmingly white. Today, everything would change. Carmelo Parker, 38 years old and every bit the self-made man, had just completed the biggest deal of his career. After months of negotiations, he had officially become the new owner of Ridgefield Country Club. He had envisioned this day many times, walking through those large wooden doors as the man in charge, not just another guest. The weight of the accomplishment pressed down on him, but it was a good kind of pressure, a feeling of finally stepping into the space he'd always felt he deserved. He adjusted his tie in the rearview mirror, feeling the sharpness of his charcoal suit, and smiled. "Let's do this," he muttered to himself, grabbing his briefcase and stepping out of the car. The driveway was lined with luxury vehicles, sleek and polished, much like the club itself. A valet approached him, but Carmelo waved him off. He wanted to walk in on his own terms today. His shoes crunched against the gravel, and he straightened his posture, standing tall as he approached the entrance. As he neared the front gate, a security guard, tall and burly, stepped in front of him. "Can I help you?" the guard asked, his tone flat, his eyes scanning Carmelo with a look that was all too familiar. "Yes, I'm here to see the manager," Carmelo replied, keeping his voice calm. He wasn't here for a confrontation, just a smooth start to his new venture. The guard's eyes narrowed, taking in Carmelo's appearance, as though assessing whether he belonged. "Do you have an appointment?" Carmelo frowned slightly. "I don't need an appointment. I'm the new—" "Hold up," the guard interrupted, his hand lifting in a halting motion. "You need to be on the guest list to get in here. No exceptions." Carmelo took a deep breath, steadying himself. This wasn't the first time someone had made assumptions about him based on his appearance, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. "I'm not here as a guest. I'm here as the new owner, Carmelo Parker." The guard's face didn't change. In fact, his expression hardened. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but we've had trouble with people trying to get in here before. If you're not on the list, you're not getting in." Carmelo's jaw clenched. He could feel the stares from nearby patrons and staff, all watching, all waiting for him to either back down or escalate. He wasn't about to do either. "Call your manager," Carmelo said, his voice firm but still measured. "They'll clear this up." The guard didn't move, just folded his arms across his chest. "I said, if you're not on the list, you're not coming in. You need to leave." Carmelo felt a flicker of anger flare up inside him. It wasn't just the inconvenience. It was the disrespect, the assumption that a black man in an expensive suit was out of place here. He thought back to all the times he had been turned away, doubted, or underestimated. It had fueled him to get to where he was now. But today, it wasn't about proving himself. He already had. Before Carmelo could say another word, another security guard walked up, sensing the tension. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his eyes flicking between Carmelo and the first guard. "This guy says he's the new owner," the first guard scoffed, loud enough for everyone within earshot to hear. "But I don't buy it." The second guard looked at Carmelo, then at his colleague. "Wait here," he said, before turning to speak into his radio. A few moments later, he returned, and with him was the club manager, an older man named Gregory Davis, who had overseen the club's operations for the past 15 years. "Carmelo, right?" Gregory said, his face breaking into a polite, if somewhat strained, smile. "I apologize for the confusion. You're absolutely welcome here." He shot a glare at the security guards. "Let him through." The first guard hesitated for a moment, looking bewildered, then reluctantly stepped aside. Carmelo could see the surprise and discomfort in his eyes, as if the idea of someone like him owning this club didn't compute. Carmelo took a step forward, locking eyes with the guard for a brief moment before turning his attention back to Gregory. "I appreciate it, but this needs to be addressed," he said quietly, the weight of the moment pressing on him. "We'll talk later." Gregory nodded, clearly eager to move past the scene. Of course, Mr. Parker, right this way. Carmelo walked through the gates of the Ridgefield Country Club for the first time as its rightful owner. He tried to shake off the humiliation of the encounter, but it clung to him, shadowing his steps as he made his way toward the main building. This was supposed to be a triumphant moment, a day of celebration, but instead, it felt like just another reminder of the barriers he'd fought so hard to break through. As they reached the entrance of the club's grand hall, Gregory turned to him, trying to recover the tone of the meeting. We've prepared everything for your walkthrough today. I can show you the updates we've been working on, and we have a small welcome reception planned later this afternoon. Carmelo nodded, but his mind was still on what had just happened. He was no stranger to these kinds of encounters, but this one stung in a way he hadn't expected. Ownership, success, status, none of it seemed to protect him from the same old prejudices. He had fought too hard for this moment to be ruined, though. With renewed resolve, Carmelo straightened his jacket and looked ahead. This was his club now, and it was time to make it clear to everyone, starting today. Carmelo walked into the heart of the club, his footsteps echoing softly on the polished marble floors. The grand entrance hall was breathtaking. Vaulted ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and walls adorned with historic portraits of past club presidents, all of whom were white men in suits, gazing down as if to remind every visitor who held power here. But today, things were different. Today, Carmelo was the one in control, whether the walls and the people within them realized it or not. Gregory led him through the hall, gesturing toward various improvements that had been made in recent months. The newly renovated lounge, the expanded dining area, the upgraded golf course. Carmelo nodded as Gregory spoke, but his attention kept drifting back to the uncomfortable reality that had greeted him at the gate. So, Mr. Parker, as you can see, we've been making strides to maintain the exclusivity and class that Ridgefield has always been known for, Gregory said, his voice oozing with practiced professionalism. We want to ensure that the legacy of this club remains intact, even with the new changes. There it was, the subtle but unmistakable acknowledgement of Carmelo's presence as something of a disruption. He wasn't just a new owner, he was an unexpected owner. Someone who didn't fit the mold of what Ridgefield had always represented. Carmelo glanced at Gregory, picking up on the subtext but deciding not to engage. Not yet. As they reached the main dining room, Carmelo took in the sight of the immaculately set tables, the pristine white linens, and the view of the lush green golf course beyond the glass walls. A few members were already seated, sipping cocktails, their voices low as they discussed business, golf scores, and weekend plans. The murmur of their conversations was a reminder of how out of place Carmelo would have been here not too long ago. But now, he was their equal. No, he was their superior. "How's business today?" Carmelo asked, turning to Gregory as they walked through the dining area. "I assume the members are happy with the changes so far?" Gregory hesitated for just a second before answering. "Yes, of course. The members are pleased. We've had a few concerns raised about the direction the club might take under new ownership, but I've assured them that things will remain familiar." Carmelo raised an eyebrow. "Familiar?" "Yes," Gregory said quickly, realizing his misstep. "I mean, we don't want to alienate the long-time members, you know. They value tradition." Carmelo stopped walking and turned to face Gregory, his gaze steady. "I understand the importance of tradition, Gregory, but things are going to change around here. And I don't just mean the renovations." Gregory looked slightly uncomfortable, but managed a tight smile. "Of course, Mr. Parker. We'll do whatever you feel is best." Carmelo's eyes flicked to the members seated nearby. He could feel their gazes on him, subtle but piercing, as if they were trying to place him, trying to understand how someone like him had managed to ascend to this position. He straightened his jacket, then addressed Gregory again, his voice calm but firm. "I've worked hard to get here, and I plan to make this club reflect a more inclusive vision of success. The days of Ridgefield being an exclusive space for a select few are over. It's time for everyone, regardless of their background, to feel welcome here." Gregory nodded, though it was clear he didn't fully grasp the weight of what Carmelo was saying. "Understood, Mr. Parker. We'll work on it." Carmelo let the conversation end there for now. He knew change wouldn't come overnight, and some of the members would resist, maybe even fight him on it. But he hadn't come this far just to play by the old rules. He had built his real estate empire by rewriting the rules, and this club would be no different. As they continued the tour, Carmelo's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from his assistant, Rachel. "Rachel, heard about the gate situation? Want me to handle it?" Carmelo sighed. Rachel had always been quick to pick up on the smallest hints of trouble, and she was fiercely protective of his time and his reputation. He appreciated it, but this was one situation he needed to handle personally. "Carmelo, I'll deal with it. Thanks for the heads up." Slipping the phone back into his pocket, he followed Gregory into the executive lounge, a space reserved for high-tier members, often used for private meetings and social gatherings. It was dimly lit, with dark wood paneling and plush leather chairs arranged in cozy clusters. The air was thick with the scent of cigars and expensive whiskey. As they entered, Carmelo noticed several men seated around a table near the fireplace. They glanced up at him, their conversations halting for just a moment. One of the men, an older gentleman with graying hair and a finely tailored suit, locked eyes with Carmelo and gave him a once-over that was impossible to misinterpret. "New blood, huh?" the man said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I didn't realize we were letting just anyone into the executive lounge these days." Carmelo's jaw tightened, but he didn't miss a beat. "I'm not just anyone," he said evenly. "I'm the new owner." The man's eyebrows shot up in surprise, and his companions exchanged uneasy glances. For a moment, there was an awkward silence, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire in the hearth. The man blinked, clearly taken aback, but before he could respond, Carmelo turned to Gregory. "I'll be expecting a full report on the club's finances by the end of the week," Carmelo said, his tone leaving no room for debate. "And we'll be having a meeting with the board soon to discuss some new initiatives." Gregory nodded quickly, eager to move past the tension. "Of course, Mr. Parker. I'll get everything prepared." Without another word, Carmelo walked past the table of men and toward the exit. As he reached the door, he paused for a moment, glancing back at the group. Their expressions were a mix of shock, confusion, and for a few, thinly veiled contempt. Carmelo didn't care. This was his club now, and no matter how uncomfortable it made them, he wasn't going anywhere. Stepping out of the lounge, he took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the confrontation beginning to lift. He had a long road ahead, but he was ready for it. Change was coming to Ridgefield, and he was going to make sure of it. The next morning, Carmelo sat at his desk, staring out the window of his downtown office. The skyline of the city stretched before him, a testament to the hard work and determination that had gotten him here. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the events at Ridgefield Country Club. The humiliation at the gate, the cold reception in the executive lounge, it wasn't just about the disrespect he'd faced. It was about the underlying problem that Ridgefield represented. This club, and others like it, were relics of an era where people like him were kept out, no matter how much wealth or power they amassed. He had fought for years to build his business from the ground up, overcoming racial prejudice and systemic barriers at every turn. He'd broken into industries that weren't designed for people like him. Now, owning Ridgefield was supposed to be the ultimate validation. But instead, it felt like a reminder of how much further society still had to go. As he scrolled through the morning's emails, a knock on his office door brought him out of his thoughts. "Come in," he called. The door swung open, and Rachel stepped inside. Dressed in a sharp blazer, her presence was as commanding as ever. Rachel had been Carmelo's assistant for the past 5 years, but she was more than just that. She was his confidant, his strategist, and often his voice of reason when things got tough. She carried a tablet in one hand and a determined look on her face. "You need to see this," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. She tapped a few buttons on the tablet and handed it to him. Carmelo glanced at the screen, and his eyes narrowed as he saw what she was referring to. It was a video, posted just this morning, showing the altercation at the gate from the day before. Someone must have recorded it, probably one of the members. The video had already gone viral, with hundreds of comments piling in by the minute. The caption read, Black man denied entry to country club. Racism at Ridgefield? Carmelo's heart sank as he hit play. The video showed the security guard blocking his path, their heated exchange, and then the moment when the police arrived. The comments below the video were a mixed bag, some expressing outrage at the blatant racism, others downplaying it or outright defending the club's actions. "This is the last thing we need," Rachel said, pacing the room. "The media is already starting to pick it up. You know how this is going to play out." Carmelo set the tablet down, rubbing his temples. "I thought buying this club would change things. I wanted to prove that I belonged, that we belonged. But now this, it's like they're daring me to quit before I even get started." Rachel stopped pacing and looked at him with a sharp gaze. "No, this is exactly why you can't quit. This isn't just about you, Carmelo. This is about everyone who's been told they don't belong in places like that. You've got to show them that you're here to stay and you're going to change things." Carmelo leaned back in his chair, contemplating her words. Rachel was right, as usual. He couldn't let this moment define him or his ownership of Ridgefield. He had to take control of the narrative before it spiraled out of control. "All right," he said, his voice firmer now. "We need to get ahead of this. I'll release a statement about what happened, but we need more than just damage control. I want to hold a press conference at the club. I'll address this head on and make it clear that this kind of behavior isn't going to be tolerated by anyone." Rachel nodded, her eyes lighting up with approval. "That's the Carmelo I know. I'll get in touch with the press and set everything up for tomorrow. We'll invite a diverse group of reporters, make sure the right people are asking the questions." Carmelo smiled at her, grateful for her unwavering support. "Thanks, Rachel. I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'd probably be a lot less organized for one," she said with a smirk before turning and heading toward the door. "I'll get everything moving. We're going to turn this thing around." As Rachel left the office, Carmelo turned back to the window, his resolve growing stronger. The next time he walked through those gates at Ridgefield, it wouldn't be as someone seeking validation. It would be as a leader, someone who had a vision for the future of that club and for the future of spaces like it. The following afternoon, the press gathered outside Ridgefield Country Club. Cameramen set up their equipment, reporters huddled together, microphones in hand, ready for the story of the day. Carmelo stood inside the main building, watching through the large windows as the crowd grew. A part of him felt the weight of what was about to happen. The eyes of the city, maybe even the nation, were on him now. But he was ready for it. Rachel walked up beside him, handing him a folder with notes for his statement. "It's going to be fine. You've handled tougher crowds than this," she said, offering him a reassuring smile. Carmelo nodded. "I know, but this feels different." "You're doing the right thing," she said. "People are going to see that." Taking a deep breath, Carmelo adjusted his suit jacket and stepped outside. The cameras turned toward him instantly, reporters calling his name, asking questions before he even reached the podium. The sound of shutters clicking filled the air as photographers tried to capture every angle of this moment. Carmelo stood tall at the podium, waiting for the crowd to settle. When the noise finally died down, he began to speak. "Good afternoon," he started, his voice clear and steady. "I know many of you have seen the video of what happened yesterday at the gates of Ridgefield Country Club, and I know that for some it was shocking to see such an incident take place in 2024. But for many others, including myself, this wasn't shocking at all. It was a reminder of the barriers that still exist for people of color in spaces like this." He paused, letting the words sink in, as the crowd remained silent, hanging on his every word. "I bought Ridgefield Country Club because I believe in change. I believe that these spaces once reserved for the few, can and should be open to everyone, regardless of race, gender, or background. What happened yesterday was unacceptable, and I can assure you that changes are already being made to ensure that this kind of incident never happens again." The crowd shifted, a few reporters scribbling notes while others waited for more. "This is more than just a club," Carmelo continued. "It's a symbol of progress, of what we can achieve when we break down the walls that have kept so many of us out. And I'm here to make sure that Ridgefield becomes a place where everyone is welcome. where everyone belongs. As he finished his statement, Carmelo could feel the energy in the air shift. The press conference had just begun, but he had already taken control of the narrative. Now it was time to make good on his promise. The press conference concluded with Carmelo answering a flurry of questions, each one probing deeper into his vision for the club's future. The questions varied, some supportive and others skeptical, but Carmelo remained composed, delivering his answers with confidence. By the end, there was no doubt that this story was going to dominate headlines for days. As the crowd began to disperse, Rachel walked over to Carmelo, her face a mix of pride and concern. "You handled that well," she said, glancing over at the last few reporters still lingering. "But you know this isn't over. There are going to be people who'll push back hard." Carmelo sighed, nodding. "Yeah, I know, but I'm not backing down." "Good," Rachel replied firmly, "because now we have to move fast. The members are going to want answers, the board too." Carmelo took a deep breath. "Let's go meet with the board. I need them to understand where I'm coming from and what changes are coming their way." The board meeting took place in the private dining room of the country club, where the portraits of past presidents lined the walls like silent witnesses to the unfolding drama. Carmelo entered the room to find the board members already seated, their faces a blend of uncertainty and, in some cases, hostility. At the head of the table sat Charles Everly, the longest-serving board member and a man whose family had been members of Ridgefield for generations. He was in his early 60s, his silver hair combed neatly back, and his expression was one of barely concealed disdain. Carmelo knew from the moment he had purchased the club that Charles would be the biggest obstacle to change. He represented everything Ridgefield had once stood for: tradition, exclusivity, and whether he admitted it or not, a sense of superiority. "Mr. Parker," Charles greeted, his voice formal but cold. "We've been following the media coverage closely. Quite a spectacle this morning." Carmelo nodded, taking a seat at the opposite end of the table. "I thought it was important to be transparent with the public. What happened yesterday wasn't acceptable, and it's my responsibility to address it." "Yes, well," Charles continued, "while I understand your desire for transparency, Ridgefield has always prided itself on discretion. We've never needed the spotlight on us before, and I think I speak for many of the members when I say that this kind of attention is unsettling." Carmelo met Charles's gaze steadily. "Ridgefield is changing, and the kind of attention we're getting right now is necessary. This club has operated in the shadows for too long, shutting out people who could bring a lot to the table just because they don't fit the mold of what's considered acceptable. That's no longer going to be the case." There was a slight murmur among the board members, most of them shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Joan Prescott, one of the few women on the board, raised her hand slightly to speak. "Mr. Parker," she began, her tone more measured than Charles's, "we appreciate your commitment to inclusivity, but Ridgefield has a long history of maintaining certain standards. People join this club because they want to be part of a community with shared values. If we make drastic changes, we risk alienating our current members. Many of them are already concerned about what's happening." Carmelo leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "I'm not here to dismantle what makes Ridgefield special. I understand the importance of community and tradition, but we can't hide behind those things to justify keeping people out. Inclusivity doesn't lower the standards, it raises them. It brings in fresh perspectives, new ideas, and ultimately makes this club stronger." Charles leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "And what about the members who feel differently, who feel that this club is being taken in a direction they didn't sign up for?" Carmelo didn't hesitate. "They're free to leave, but I think you'll find that most people will adapt. They'll see the benefits of being part of a club that reflects the world we live in today, not the world of 50 years ago." A tense silence filled the room as the board members absorbed his words. Carmelo knew he was walking a fine line. Too much pushback, and he could face a revolt from the members, or worse, the board could vote to undermine his authority. But if he didn't push for change, he risked letting the club remain a relic of the past. "I want to make one thing clear," Carmelo said, breaking the silence. I didn't buy Ridgefield to tear it apart. I bought it to elevate it. I want to make this place a symbol of what's possible when we embrace progress. Yes, there will be changes. We'll be expanding membership, bringing in new programs, and making this a club where everyone, regardless of their background, feels welcome. But I'm not compromising on the quality or the experience. In fact, I'm raising the bar. Charles's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Carmelo thought he might continue to push back. But then the older man sighed, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Mr. Parker," Charles began, his tone still cold but less combative, "I can see you're serious about this, and while I may not agree with every decision, I do recognize that you are now the owner. However, I hope you understand that many of us have deep ties to this club, and we won't stand by if we feel that those ties are being cut too quickly." Carmelo nodded, acknowledging the underlying warning. "I understand, Charles, and I'm committed to working with the board to ensure that Ridgefield remains a place its members can be proud of." The tension in the room eased slightly, but Carmelo knew this was just the beginning. He had won a small victory today, but the real battle for the soul of Ridgefield was only starting. After the meeting, Carmelo stepped outside into the warm afternoon sun. The sky was clear, and the sound of golfers chatting and laughing drifted from the course. For a moment, he allowed himself to relax, breathing in the fresh air. "That could have gone worse," Rachel said, appearing by his side. Carmelo chuckled. "Yeah, I suppose it could have, but we've got a long way to go." Rachel nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon. "They're going to push back harder, you know. The old guard isn't going to let go easily." "I'm not expecting them to," Carmelo replied, his voice resolute. "But they're going to have to deal with it. Ridgefield is changing, whether they like it or not." As they stood there, the sun beginning to dip lower in the sky, Carmelo felt a sense of purpose settle over him. This wasn't just about owning a club. It was about rewriting the rules for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And he was just getting started. It had been a few weeks since the press conference and Carmelo's tense meeting with the board. In that short time, the changes at Ridgefield were already starting to take shape, though not without resistance. Carmelo had expected pushback, but the sheer scale of the response, both positive and negative, was something he hadn't fully anticipated. As he sat at the head of the long oak boardroom table, Carmelo couldn't help but reflect on how far things had come. There had been some rocky moments, especially with members like Charles Everly, who had made it clear from day one that they were not on board with the new direction. But little by little, the changes were taking root. One of the first major adjustments Carmelo had implemented was opening membership to a more diverse group of applicants. He'd reduced the astronomical fees that had long kept people of modest means, particularly people of color, away from places like Ridgefield. Now, families from all walks of life were applying, and the list of potential new members was growing every day. Still, the old guard wasn't pleased. Several of the club's wealthiest, longtime members had either threatened to leave or had already submitted their resignations in protest. Carmelo knew he couldn't please everyone, but that wasn't the goal. His vision was bigger than a few disgruntled elites clinging to the past. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Rachel entered the room, a folder tucked under her arm. "Looks like we've got our first wave of feedback from the membership drive," she said, handing him the folder. Carmelo opened it, his eyes scanning the pages of information. The data showed that applications had surged, with an overwhelming number of minority families and younger professionals interested in joining Ridgefield. It was exactly what he had hoped for, people who were eager to be part of a community that reflected modern values. "Good news?" Rachel asked, leaning against the doorframe. Carmelo nodded. "Yeah, it's good. The new membership applications are pouring in. But you know what that means. The old guard is going to push back even harder." Rachel shrugged. "Let them. They're dinosaurs, and they know it. This place is changing, whether they like it or not." Carmelo smiled at her bluntness. "Yeah, but they won't go quietly. We've already lost a few of the big donors." Rachel rolled her eyes. "Good riddance. They're the same people who blocked change for decades. Losing them isn't a loss, it's an opportunity." Carmelo admired Rachel's attitude. She always knew how to keep him focused on the bigger picture. But he knew that the fight ahead wouldn't just be with the members who were leaving. It would be with those who stayed and tried to undermine his efforts from within. "Let's keep our eye on the ball," Carmelo said, closing the folder. "The big event is coming up, and we need to make sure it's a success." The event he was referring to was Ridgefield's relaunch, a grand gala that would be the first of its kind under Carmelo's leadership. It was meant to symbolize the club's new era of inclusivity, where everyone, regardless of race or background, was welcome. Invitations had been sent far and wide, including to influential community leaders, activists, and a diverse group of prominent business people who reflected the future Carmelo wanted for the club. Rachel nodded. "Everything's on track for the gala. We've confirmed most of the VIPs, and we've gotten some great press interest. It's going to be a packed event." Carmelo leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the upcoming evening settle on his shoulders. This gala was more than just a party. It was a statement, a chance to show the world that Ridgefield had truly changed. But it was also a risk. If it didn't go well, it could set back all the progress he'd made. "Thanks, Rachel. Let's make sure we don't miss a single detail. This has to be perfect." The night of the gala arrived, and Ridgefield Country Club was transformed. Twinkling lights lined the pathways leading up to the grand entrance, where a red carpet had been laid out for guests. The club's facade, which had always been imposing and exclusive, now felt welcoming and alive. Music floated through the air, and the scent of gourmet food being prepared for the evening's dinner wafted across the courtyard. As guests began to arrive, Carmelo stood near the entrance, greeting them personally. He shook hands with community leaders, activists, and new members who had been invited to see what Ridgefield was becoming. For many, this was their first time stepping foot inside the exclusive club, and the significance wasn't lost on them. "Mr. Parker, it's an honor to be here," said Marsha Jackson, a prominent local activist who had been fighting for greater inclusivity in public spaces for years. "I never thought I'd see the day when a place like this would welcome people like me." Carmelo smiled warmly. "It's long overdue, Marsha. We're just getting started." As more guests filtered in, the atmosphere was electric. People from all backgrounds mingled, exchanging ideas and sharing in the excitement of the evening. Carmelo felt a swell of pride. This was exactly what he had envisioned. Ridgefield was no longer just a playground for the elite. It was becoming a symbol of progress. But not everyone was pleased. From across the room, Carmelo spotted Charles Everly and a small group of longtime members gathered in the corner, their expressions tight and disapproving. They watched the evening's festivities with a mixture of contempt and suspicion. Charles had made no secret of his opposition to the new direction, and Carmelo knew that tonight might be the last straw for him and others like him. Still, Carmelo wasn't about to let their negativity ruin the night. He had worked too hard for this moment, and nothing was going to derail it. As the night wore on, Carmelo took to the stage to address the crowd. The room fell silent as he stepped up to the microphone, the spotlight illuminating him against the backdrop of the grand ballroom. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice steady and confident. "Thank you all for being here tonight. This gala marks the beginning of a new chapter for Ridgefield Country Club. A chapter where we embrace not just tradition, but also progress, where we open our doors to people from all walks of life and create a community that is inclusive, welcoming, and forward-thinking." There was a ripple of applause from the audience, and Carmelo continued. "This club has been a symbol of exclusivity for too long. It's time for that to change. Tonight, we celebrate not only the history of Ridgefield, but its future, one where everyone belongs, and I'm proud to say that we're already well on our way." The crowd erupted into applause, and Carmelo smiled, feeling the weight of the moment sink in. This wasn't just about the club anymore. This was about something bigger, a statement to the world that progress, no matter how slow, was inevitable. As he stepped down from the stage, Carmelo caught a glimpse of Charles Everly, his face stony and unmoved. The battle with the old guard wasn't over, but tonight was a victory, and Carmelo was more determined than ever to see his vision through. As the night wore on, the energy in the room remained electric. The guests mingled, danced, and enjoyed the luxurious spread of food and drinks. But more importantly, they engaged in conversations that wouldn't have happened at Ridgefield even a few months ago. Carmelo moved through the crowd, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries, and soaking in the atmosphere of the night. Rachel approached him, a glass of champagne in hand and a satisfied smile on her face. "You did it," she said, raising the glass toward him in a small toast. "This is what you've been working for." Carmelo clinked his glass against hers, smiling. "It feels surreal, but yeah, I think we're finally turning a corner." They both took a sip, and Rachel glanced around the room. "You've got a lot of support here. I've overheard some great conversations about what this place is becoming. People are excited." Carmelo nodded. "It's a start, but we both know there's still a lot of work to do." Rachel's gaze shifted across the room, and her expression hardened slightly. Carmelo followed her line of sight and saw what she was looking at: Charles Everly, standing near the bar with several of his old guard allies. Their arms were crossed, their faces locked in disapproving scowls. They were clearly out of place, uncomfortable in this new environment that didn't cater to them anymore. "They're not going to let it go," Rachel said quietly. Carmelo sighed. "No, they're not, but this isn't their club anymore. Not the way they want it to be anyway." Rachel nodded in agreement. "You're right, but I wouldn't be surprised if they try something. You know Charles is stubborn." Carmelo wasn't naive. He knew that Charles wasn't just going to quietly fade away. He would either fight back or leave, and he would likely take some of the old guard with him. But Carmelo was ready for whatever came next. He hadn't come this far just to be intimidated into backing down. As the gala began to wind down, Carmelo took a moment to step outside and get some fresh air. The cool night breeze was a welcome contrast to the warmth of the ballroom. He leaned against one of the club's grand pillars, looking out over the pristine golf course, which was now bathed in the soft glow of the moon. It had been a long journey to get here. Years of hard work, of being underestimated, of fighting to break into spaces that had never been meant for people like him. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he belonged. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. Turning, Carmelo saw Charles Everly walking toward him, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his tailored jacket. The tension between them was palpable, but Carmelo held his ground. "Nice party," Charles said, his tone dry, though his eyes held a trace of something else, something more guarded. "Thanks," Carmelo replied, his voice calm but firm. "It's been a good night." Charles stopped a few feet away from him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them filled with unspoken tension. Finally, Charles broke the silence. "You've changed this place," he said, his voice low but steady. "More than I ever thought possible." Carmelo studied him carefully, trying to gauge where this conversation was heading. "That's the point. Ridgefield needed to change." Charles sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. "You know, my father helped build this club. He was one of the founding members. For as long as I can remember, Ridgefield has been a part of my life, a part of my family's legacy." Carmelo nodded, understanding the weight of what Charles was saying, even if they didn't see eye to eye on what Ridgefield's future should look like. "I respect that, Charles, but the world has changed, and Ridgefield has to change with it." Charles looked down at the ground for a moment, then back up at Carmelo. "I know you think this is progress, and maybe for you it is, but for people like me, for people who built this place, it feels like we're being pushed out." Carmelo shook his head. "No one's pushing you out, but I can't let this club stay stuck in the past, pretending like the world outside hasn't evolved. It's not just about you or me anymore, Charles. It's about creating a space where everyone can feel welcome, where everyone can belong." Charles was quiet for a long moment, as if weighing Carmelo's words. Finally, he exhaled slowly, his expression softening just slightly. "I don't like it," he admitted, his voice almost resigned. "But I guess I don't have a say in it anymore." Carmelo crossed his arms, leaning against the pillar. "You do have a say, Charles. You've got a place here if you want it. But Ridgefield isn't going back to what it was. You have to decide if you're willing to be part of what it's becoming." Charles met Carmelo's eyes, and for the first time that evening, there was no animosity in his gaze, just a kind of tired acceptance. "I'll think about it," Charles said quietly, his voice lacking the bravado it had carried in previous conversations. With that, he gave a small nod and turned to walk back inside, leaving Carmelo alone with his thoughts. Carmelo watched him go, unsure of what Charles's decision would be, but feeling a sense of closure nonetheless. He knew he couldn't force everyone to embrace change. Some people would leave, and others, like Charles, might struggle to find their place in the new Ridgefield. But what mattered most was that the future was open now, and Carmelo had paved the way for a new generation to take their rightful place at the table. The next morning, Carmelo stood on the balcony of his home, looking out over the city as the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds. The gala had been a success, but he knew the real work was just beginning. Changing Ridgefield was more than just a single event or a few policy changes. It was about creating a legacy, one that would last long after he was gone. As he sipped his coffee, Carmelo thought about the road ahead. There would be more challenges, more obstacles to overcome. But he was ready. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Ridgefield was no longer just a country club. It was a symbol of something bigger, something more important than tradition or status. It was a place where people could come together, regardless of where they came from or what they looked like. And that was a legacy worth fighting for. With a sense of peace settling over him, Carmelo turned back toward his home, ready to face whatever came next.